Orphan boy shared his bread with a native child. By nightfall, 300 Apaches stood in his yard. This is the remarkable story of 12-year-old Timothy Joseph McKenna, an Irish orphan whose simple act of sharing his meager meal with a starving Apache child would trigger one of the most extraordinary gatherings in the history of the American Southwest. You're about to witness how one boy's innocent compassion bridged two worlds torn apart by violence and prejudice, proving that kindness truly knows no boundaries of race or circumstance. If this incredible tale of childhood generosity creating lasting bonds between enemies moves your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our inspiring stories from the Old West. Now let me take you back to the scorching summer of 1878, to a dusty trading settlement in Arizona Territory, where a hungry orphan boy would unknowingly change the course of history with nothing more than half a loaf of bread. The relentless Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the small settlement of Mesquite Flats, casting shimmering heat waves across the dusty main street and making every shadow a precious refuge from the blazing temperatures. It was July 14, 1878, and the thermometer outside Murphy's General Store had already climbed past 100 degrees before 10 o'clock in the morning, promising another day of the punishing heat that made summer survival in the Sonoran Desert a constant struggle for both man and beast. Timothy Joseph McKenna sat in the narrow strip of shade behind Kellerman's blacksmith shop, carefully dividing his breakfast of day-old bread and dried beef into 2 equal portions. At 12 years old, Timothy was small for his age, with unruly red hair that defied all attempts at combing, bright green eyes that held both intelligence and wariness, and freckled skin that had been burned and reburned by the desert sun until it had finally achieved a permanent tan that marked him as a child of the frontier. Timothy had been living in Mesquite Flats for 8 months now, ever since the wagon train carrying his family had been attacked by bandits near Tucson. His parents, Patrick and Molly McKenna, had been killed in the attack, along with his baby sister Kathleen, leaving Timothy as the sole survivor of a family that had traveled from Boston to Arizona Territory in search of a better life and new opportunities in the West. The boy had been taken in by Father Miguel Hernandez, the elderly Mexican priest who served the small Catholic church in Mesquite Flats and who had made it his mission to care for the orphans and abandoned children who seemed to accumulate in every frontier settlement. Father Hernandez was a man of 73 years, with snow-white hair and gentle brown eyes that reflected a lifetime of ministering to the poor and desperate people who populated the borderlands between Mexico and the United States. The priest operated what could charitably be called an orphanage in the back rooms of the church, though it was really just a series of small chambers where homeless children could sleep on straw mattresses and receive 1 meal a day from the church's limited resources. Father Hernandez survived on donations from the settlement's more prosperous residents and on the occasional charity from passing travelers, but resources were always scarce, and meals were often meager. Timothy had learned to supplement the church's modest provisions by doing odd jobs around the settlement, sweeping out saloons, helping at the blacksmith shop, carrying water for the women who took in washing, and running errands for merchants who needed quick feet and honest hands. The work was hard for a boy his age, but it provided him with small coins that could be converted into food when the church's supplies ran low. This particular morning, Timothy had earned 15 cents by helping Jake Kellerman shoe a particularly difficult horse, and he'd used 10 cents of it to buy bread and dried meat from Murphy's store. The remaining 5 cents was carefully wrapped in a piece of cloth and hidden in his pocket, saved against the day when Father Hernandez might need help purchasing supplies for the other orphans under his care. As Timothy sat eating his breakfast and planning his day, he became aware of movement in the desert scrub beyond the edge of the settlement. At first, he thought it might be a stray dog or perhaps a javelina looking for water, but as he watched more carefully, he realized that the movement was too deliberate and purposeful to be an animal. Someone was hiding in the mesquite and palo verde trees that grew along the dry creek bed about 50 yards from where Timothy sat. The person was staying low and moving carefully, obviously trying to avoid detection by the residents of Mesquite Flats. Timothy's first instinct was to call out an alarm, but something about the furtive movements suggested desperation rather than danger, need rather than threat. Curiosity overcoming caution, Timothy finished his meal, pocketed the second portion he'd prepared, and walked casually toward the edge of town, pretending to be exploring while actually trying to get a better look at whoever was hiding in the brush. As he drew closer, the movement stopped completely, and Timothy realized that the hidden person was aware of his approach and was trying to remain completely concealed. "I know you're there," Timothy called out softly, using the mixture of English, Spanish, and frontier gestures that had become his way of communicating in the multicultural environment of the borderlands. "I'm not going to hurt you or call for help. I just want to see if you need anything." For several long moments, there was no response from the brush, and Timothy began to wonder if he'd been mistaken about seeing someone there. But then, slowly and hesitantly, a small figure emerged from behind a large palo verde tree, and Timothy found himself looking at a Native American child who appeared to be about his own age. The child was clearly Apache, based on the traditional clothing and the distinctive hairstyle that Timothy had learned to recognize during his months in Arizona Territory. But what struck Timothy most forcibly was the obvious condition of starvation and exhaustion that marked every aspect of the child's appearance. The young Apache was painfully thin, with hollow cheeks and prominent ribs that spoke of extended hunger. His clothing, while traditional in style, was ragged and worn, patched in multiple places, and obviously inadequate protection against the elements. Most telling of all were his eyes, which held the desperate look of someone who had been surviving on the very edge of existence for far too long. Timothy's heart went out immediately to this suffering child, and without thinking about the potential dangers or complications of his action, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the second portion of food he'd prepared for later in the day. "Are you hungry?" Timothy asked, holding up the bread and dried meat so the Apache child could see what he was offering. "I have extra food if you want some." The Apache child stared at Timothy with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope, clearly torn between the instinct to flee and the overwhelming need for nourishment. Timothy could see the internal struggle playing out in the child's expression, and he understood that any sudden movement or threatening gesture could send the young Apache running back into the desert. Moving very slowly and keeping his voice soft and non-threatening, Timothy placed the food on a flat rock about halfway between himself and the Apache child, then stepped back several paces to demonstrate that he wasn't trying to trap or capture his visitor. "It's okay," Timothy said gently. "Take it. I know what it's like to be hungry." The Apache child watched Timothy carefully for several more moments, then crept forward cautiously and snatched the food from the rock, retreating quickly to a safe distance before beginning to eat with the desperate intensity of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. As the child ate, Timothy was able to observe him more closely and gather more information about his condition and circumstances. The young Apache was indeed about Timothy's age, probably 11 or 12 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of natural dignity that seemed to characterize his people even in the worst circumstances. But beyond the obvious hunger and exhaustion, Timothy could see signs of recent trauma that suggested this child had experienced violence or loss. There were healing cuts on his arms and hands. His hair was singed as if he'd been near a fire, and he moved with the careful wariness of someone who had learned to expect danger from every direction. When the child had finished eating, he looked up at Timothy with an expression that combined gratitude, surprise, and continued wariness. It was clear that he hadn't expected kindness from a white boy, and he wasn't sure how to respond to the unexpected generosity he'd received. "What's your name?" Timothy asked, pointing to himself and saying Timothy slowly and clearly. The Apache child hesitated for a moment, then pointed to himself and spoke a word in his native language that sounded like Nalti to Timothy's ears. The boy repeated the name several times, trying to help Timothy understand the correct pronunciation, and gradually they established a basic form of communication. Through gestures, simple words, and patient repetition, Timothy learned that Nalti's band had been attacked by cavalry soldiers about a week earlier, and that he had become separated from his family during the chaos of the battle. He'd been wandering in the desert ever since, trying to find his way back to his people while avoiding the settlements and military patrols that posed threats to a lone Apache child. Nalte's story was heartbreakingly similar to Timothy's own experience of loss and displacement, and the Irish orphan felt an immediate kinship with this Apache boy who had also lost everything and was struggling to survive alone in a hostile world. The fact that their peoples were supposed to be enemies seemed irrelevant compared to their shared experience of childhood tragedy and abandonment. "You can't stay out here by yourself," Timothy said, though he wasn't sure how much of his words Nalte could understand. "It's too dangerous, and you'll starve or die of thirst. You need help." But even as he spoke, Timothy realized the complexity of the situation he was facing. Bringing an Apache child into Mesquite Flats would create enormous problems for both of them. The settlement had been raided by Apache war parties several times in recent years, and tensions between whites and Indians were at an extremely high level throughout Arizona Territory. Most of the residents of Mesquite Flats would view Nalte as a potential threat, or at best, as a problem that should be turned over to the military authorities. Timothy understood enough about frontier politics to know that an Apache child in white custody would likely be sent to one of the government boarding schools that were designed to strip Indian children of their cultural identity and force them to assimilate into white society. But Timothy also knew that leaving Nalte alone in the desert would be condemning him to almost certain death. The boy was already weakened by hunger and exposure, and without help he would either starve, die of thirst, or fall victim to the many dangers that threatened anyone trying to survive alone in the Sonoran Desert. Timothy made a decision that would have profound consequences for both boys and for the entire community of Mesquite Flats. Instead of taking Nalte into the settlement or abandoning him to his fate in the desert, Timothy chose a middle course that would allow him to provide help while avoiding the immediate dangers of discovery. "Wait here," Timothy told Nalte, using gestures to make his meaning clear. "I'll come back with more food and water. Don't go anywhere." Timothy returned to the settlement and spent the rest of the morning working extra jobs to earn more money for food supplies. He helped Murphy unload a wagon of goods, assisted Mrs. Patterson with her washing, and ran errands for 3 different merchants, accumulating enough coins to purchase bread, dried meat, and other supplies that would sustain Nalte for several days. But more than just providing immediate relief, Timothy was forming a plan that would address the longer-term challenge of helping Nalte find his way back to his people. The boy had described landmarks and geographical features that Timothy recognized from his own travels in the region, and he believed he could identify the general area where Nalte's band might be located. Timothy had learned much about the local geography and Indian movements from conversations with traders, scouts, and other travelers who passed through Mesquite Flats. He knew that several Apache bands had traditional camping areas in the mountains north of the settlement, and he thought he could guide Nalte toward these areas without attracting the attention of military patrols or hostile settlers. When Timothy returned to the creek bed that afternoon with a pack full of supplies, he found Nalte exactly where he'd left him, though the Apache boy was clearly nervous about remaining in one place for so long. The relief on Nalte's face when he saw Timothy approaching with food and water was evident, and Timothy could see that the Apache child had begun to trust him despite all the reasons he had to remain suspicious of whites. "I've been thinking about how to help you find your family," Timothy explained as he shared the supplies he'd brought. I know the country around here pretty well, and I think I can help you get to where your people might be camping." Nalte listened intently to Timothy's words, understanding more than he could express in English, but clearly grasping the essential meaning of what the Irish boy was proposing. His dark eyes showed both hope and apprehension as he realized that Timothy was offering to do much more than just provide a few meals. "It'll be dangerous for both of us," Timothy continued honestly. "If we're caught by soldiers or settlers, they'll think I'm helping an enemy. And if your people find us together, they might think I'm trying to hurt you or spy on them, but I think it's the right thing to do." The conversation that followed was conducted largely through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the few words they shared in common. But by the end of the afternoon, Timothy and Nalte had reached an understanding. They would travel together toward the mountain areas where Nalte's people were most likely to be found, moving at night and hiding during the day to avoid detection by military patrols and hostile civilians. Timothy knew that his plan would require him to leave Mesquite Flats temporarily, and he also knew that Father Hernandez would be worried about his absence. But the old priest had taught Timothy about the importance of compassion and charity toward those in need, and the boy felt confident that Father Hernandez would understand and approve of his mission to help a lost child find his family. That evening, Timothy visited Father Hernandez in the small room behind the church that served as the priest's private quarters. He found the elderly Mexican reading his breviary by candlelight, preparing for his evening prayers with the same devotion that had characterized his entire life of religious service. "Father," Timothy began carefully, "I need to tell you about something important, and I need your advice about what to do." Father Hernandez set down his prayer book and looked at Timothy with the gentle attention that the priest gave to all the children under his care. "What troubles you, mijo? You look as though you carry a heavy burden in your heart." Timothy took a deep breath and told Father Hernandez the entire story of his encounter with Nalte, describing the Apache child's condition, his obvious need for help, and the plan that Timothy had developed to help him return to his people. As he spoke, Timothy watched the priest's face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction to the controversial nature of what he was proposing. Father Hernandez listened without interruption until Timothy had finished his account, then sat quietly for several minutes, obviously weighing the moral, practical, and spiritual implications of the situation. Finally, the old priest spoke, his voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent ministering to people caught between conflicting loyalties and competing demands. "Timothy," Father Hernandez said slowly, "what you propose is dangerous for both you and the Apache child. If you are discovered, you could be arrested as a traitor or killed as a spy. The boy could be captured and sent away from his people forever. Are you certain that this risk is worth taking?" "Father," Timothy replied with conviction, "if I don't help him, he's going to die out there in the desert. He's just a kid like me, and he's lost and scared and starving. I know what that feels like, and I can't just walk away and let it happen to someone else." The priest nodded slowly, recognizing in Timothy's words the same compassion and moral courage that had motivated saints and martyrs throughout Christian history. "And what of the danger to yourself, mijo? You have already lost your family. Do you think it is wise to risk your own life for someone you barely know?" "Father," Timothy said quietly, "you taught me that we're supposed to help people who need help, no matter who they are or where they come from. You said that Jesus didn't ask people what tribe they belonged to before he fed them or healed them. This boy needs help, and I can help him. Doesn't that make it the right thing to do?" Father Hernandez smiled, and there was both pride and concern in his expression as he looked at this 12-year-old boy who had learned perhaps too well the lessons of Christian charity and universal love. "You are right, Timothy. The commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves does not contain exceptions for people of different races or tribes, but you must understand that doing the right thing often requires great courage and involves significant risks." The priest paused, considering his next words carefully. "If you are determined to help this Apache child, then I will not try to stop you, but I will insist that you take precautions to protect both yourself and him. You must travel carefully, avoid all contact with military patrols, and return to us as soon as you have delivered the boy safely to his people." Timothy felt a surge of relief and gratitude at the priest's words. Having Father Hernandez's approval and blessing would make the dangerous journey easier to bear and would provide moral support for the difficult decisions that lay ahead. "There is one more thing, mijo," Father Hernandez added, reaching into a wooden box beside his bed and pulling out a small silver cross on a leather cord. "Wear this during your journey. It will remind you that you travel under God's protection, and it may help others understand that your mission is one of mercy rather than war." Timothy accepted the cross with reverence, understanding the significance of the gift and the trust that Father Hernandez was placing in him. The silver cross had belonged to the priest's own father, a man who had died defending a village from bandits, and it represented a legacy of courage in service to others. That night, Timothy made his final preparations for the journey that would take him and Nalte into some of the most dangerous territory in Arizona. He packed light, carrying only the essentials: water, food, a knife, a small blanket, and the few personal possessions that connected him to his lost family. Everything had to fit in a small pack that wouldn't slow him down or make noise that might attract unwanted attention. At dawn, Timothy met Nalte at their agreed-upon rendezvous point near the dry creek bed. The Apache boy had also been making preparations, and Timothy could see that despite his youth, Nalte possessed survival skills and knowledge of the desert that would be invaluable during their journey. "Are you ready?" Timothy asked, shouldering his pack and checking to make sure his water containers were secure. Nalte nodded, his expression showing both determination and gratitude. Though they couldn't communicate easily in words, both boys understood the significance of what they were undertaking and the trust they were placing in each other. The journey that followed would test both boys in ways they couldn't have anticipated, taking them through some of the most challenging terrain in the American Southwest and bringing them face to face with dangers that threatened not just their mission, but their lives. They traveled primarily at night, using the cooler temperatures and the concealment of darkness to move through territory that was constantly patrolled by cavalry units searching for Apache raiders. During the day, they hid in caves, under rock overhangs, or in the sparse shade provided by desert vegetation, trying to rest while remaining alert for signs of discovery. Nalte proved to be an invaluable guide and teacher, showing Timothy how to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, how to identify edible plants and insects that could supplement their food supplies, and how to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of other travelers in the area. The Apache boy's knowledge of desert survival was sophisticated and comprehensive, representing generations of accumulated wisdom about living in harmony with one of North America's most challenging environments. In return, Timothy shared his own knowledge of white settlements, military procedures, and the patterns of patrol activity that they needed to avoid. His months in Mesquite Flats had taught him to recognize the sounds of approaching cavalry units, the significance of smoke signals and other military communications, and the schedules that governed fort activities and supply movements. More than just practical knowledge, the two boys were developing a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience of loss and hardship. Despite their different backgrounds and the cultural barriers that separated their peoples, they found common ground in their determination to survive and their commitment to helping each other succeed in their dangerous mission. On the third night of their journey, they encountered their first serious threat in the form of a cavalry patrol that had made camp near a water source they needed to reach. Timothy and Nalte spent hours observing the soldiers from concealment, waiting for an opportunity to approach the water without being detected. "There are too many of them," Timothy whispered to Nalta as they watched the patrol's activities from behind a boulder outcropping about 200 yards from the water source. "We'll have to find another way to get water." But Nalta had identified an alternative that Timothy hadn't noticed. A small, seep spring located in a narrow canyon about a mile from the main water source. The spring was difficult to reach and provided only a small flow of water, but it would be adequate for their needs and was unlikely to be discovered by the cavalry patrol. The detour to reach the alternate water source added several hours to their journey and required them to travel through particularly difficult terrain, but it allowed them to avoid contact with the soldiers and continue their progress toward the mountainous areas where Nalta's people were most likely to be found. By the 5th day of their journey, they had climbed into the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains, entering territory that was considered to be Apache heartland and was therefore even more dangerous for whites to traverse. Timothy understood that they were now in areas where they were more likely to encounter Apache war parties than cavalry patrols, and he relied increasingly on Nalta's knowledge of tribal customs and protocols to guide their interactions with any Indians they might meet. It was on the morning of the 6th day that they finally encountered other Apache, though not in the way that either boy had expected. Timothy was awakened from sleep by the sound of voices speaking in the Apache language, and he opened his eyes to find himself surrounded by 6 Apache warriors who had approached their hiding place without making any sound that might have alerted him to their presence. The warriors were clearly experienced fighters, armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and modern firearms that they had acquired through raids or trade. Their faces were painted for war, and their demeanor suggested that they were part of an active raiding party rather than a peaceful hunting expedition. Timothy's first instinct was to reach for his knife, but he quickly realized that any aggressive movement would likely result in his immediate death. Instead, he remained motionless and looked to Nalta for guidance on how to handle this critical encounter. Nalta had also awakened and was speaking rapidly in Apache to the assembled warriors, obviously explaining his presence and Timothy's role in helping him return to his people. The conversation was intense and animated, with several of the warriors asking sharp questions, and Nalta responding with what appeared to be detailed explanations of their journey and Timothy's motivations for helping him. Timothy couldn't understand the words being spoken, but he could read the body language and expressions of the Apache warriors, and he could see that they were struggling to understand why a white boy would risk his life to help an Apache child. The concept of cross-racial compassion was apparently as foreign to them as it would have been to most white settlers. The leader of the war party, a man in his 30s with distinctive facial scars that marked him as an experienced fighter, finally addressed Timothy directly, speaking in heavily accented English that suggested limited but functional familiarity with the white man's language. "Boy," the war chief said, his voice carrying both authority and suspicion, "this Apache child says you help him find his people. Why you do this? What you want from Apache?" Timothy understood that his answer to this question would determine not only his own fate, but also whether he would be allowed to complete his mission of returning Nalta to his family. He chose his words carefully, trying to convey both his sincere motivations and his respect for Apache customs and values. "Sir," Timothy replied, using the respectful tone that Father Hernandez had taught him to employ when addressing his elders, "I helped Nalta because he was hungry and lost and scared. He's just a kid like me, and he needed help finding his family. I didn't want anything from your people, except to make sure he got home safely." The war chief studied Timothy's face intently, obviously trying to assess the truthfulness of his words and the sincerity of his motivations. The other warriors watched this exchange with keen interest, understanding that their leader's decision would set a precedent for how their people should respond to unexpected acts of kindness from their supposed enemies. "White soldiers kill Apache children," the war chief said slowly, his words carrying the weight of painful personal experience. "White settlers take Apache land. Hunt Apache people like animals. Why should Apache believe that white boy helps Apache child from kindness of heart? Timothy felt the full weight of the historical grievances and injustices that separated their peoples, and he understood that his individual act of compassion was being measured against generations of conflict and betrayal. His answer would need to acknowledge these realities while also demonstrating that different relationships were possible. "I can't speak for other white people," Timothy said honestly. "I know that bad things have happened between your people and mine, but I also know that when I saw Nalta starving in the desert, I couldn't just walk away and let him die. My parents are dead, and I know what it's like to be alone and scared. I didn't want that to happen to him." The war chief nodded slowly, recognizing in Timothy's words a truth that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. The experience of loss and abandonment was something that both Apache and white children could share, creating a common ground that was more fundamental than the divisions imposed by adult politics and warfare. "What is your name, white boy?" the war chief asked. "Timothy McKenna, sir. I live with Father Hernandez in Mesquite Flats." "I am called Stone Eagle," the war chief replied. "I know the priest you speak of. He is a good man who helps Indian people when they need medicine or food. If you are his student, perhaps you learn some of his wisdom about helping those who suffer." The reference to Father Hernandez seemed to carry significant weight with Stone Eagle and the other Apache warriors. The elderly priest had apparently earned a reputation among the local Indian population for his willingness to provide assistance without regard to racial or cultural differences, and this reputation now served to validate Timothy's own claims of benevolent motivation. "Nalte says his people camp at Place of Many Springs," Stone Eagle continued. "This is 2 days' journey from here, in territory where many soldiers patrol. It is dangerous for white boy to travel there, but it is also dangerous for Apache child to travel alone. We will take you both to Place of Many Springs, but you must understand that once we reach Apache camp, your safety depends on how chiefs decide to treat you." Timothy felt a surge of relief at Stone Eagle's words, understanding that he and Nalte had found the help they needed to complete their dangerous journey. But he also understood the warning implicit in the war chief's words. Entering an Apache stronghold as a white outsider would expose him to risks that he couldn't fully anticipate or control. "Thank you, Stone Eagle," Timothy said with genuine gratitude. "I understand the dangers, and I accept them. All I want is to make sure Nalte gets back to his family safely." What followed was one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of white-Indian relations in the American Southwest. Timothy found himself traveling through Apache territory under the protection of a war party that would normally have considered any white person to be a potential enemy worthy of capture or death. The Apache warriors treated Timothy with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect, fascinated by this young white boy who had risked his life to help one of their children and who seemed to possess none of the hostility or arrogance that they associated with his race. They tested his endurance and survival skills, shared their knowledge of desert travel and Apache customs, and gradually began to accept him as something more than just a temporary traveling companion. Nalte served as both interpreter and cultural bridge during this remarkable journey, explaining Apache customs to Timothy, while also helping his own people understand the motivations and character of their unusual white companion. The young Apache's obvious affection and gratitude toward Timothy helped convince the warriors that the Irish boy's assistance had been genuine rather than calculated for some hidden advantage. On the second day of travel with Stone Eagle's war party, they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley that contained one of the largest Apache encampments Timothy had ever imagined. There were more than 200 wickiups spread along a stream that provided water for both the people and their large herds of horses. Smoke from cooking fires drifted up through the valley, and Timothy could see hundreds of people engaged in the daily activities of a thriving community. "Place of Many Springs," Stone Eagle announced, gesturing toward the encampment below. "Home of Chief Iron Wolf and his band. This is where Nalte's people live." As they approached the encampment, Timothy could see that their arrival was creating considerable excitement and concern among the Apache residents. Warriors emerged from their wickiups carrying weapons, women gathered children and moved toward defensive positions, and scouts raced out to meet Stone Eagle's party and determine the nature of the situation. The sight of a white boy traveling under Apache protection was unprecedented in the experience of most tribal members, and Timothy could feel hundreds of eyes watching him as they rode into the heart of the encampment. Some faces showed curiosity, others displayed suspicion or hostility, and a few reflected the kind of surprise that comes from witnessing something completely unexpected. But it was the reaction of one particular group that made Timothy's dangerous journey worthwhile. As they approached the center of the encampment, a woman emerged from one of the larger wickiups and let out a cry of joy and recognition that carried clearly across the valley. She was followed by several other people, and Timothy realized that he was witnessing the reunion between Nalte and his family. The young Apache boy slid down from the horse he had been sharing with one of Stone Eagle's warriors and ran toward the approaching group. Timothy watched with deep satisfaction as Nalte was swept up in the arms of what were obviously his mother and other family members, their voices raised in expressions of relief, joy, and gratitude that needed no translation. The family reunion continued for several minutes, with more relatives and friends joining the celebration as word spread through the camp that Nalte had returned safely. Timothy remained with Stone Eagle and the other warriors, understanding that his role in the drama was now secondary to the more important business of family reconciliation. But Timothy's presence had not been forgotten, and as the initial excitement of Nalte's return began to settle, attention turned to the white boy who had played such an unexpected role in bringing the lost child home. Chief Iron Wolf himself, a distinguished man in his 50s with the bearing and dignity that marked him as a respected leader, approached the group and requested an explanation of the unusual circumstances that had brought a white child into his territory. Stone Eagle provided a detailed account of their encounter with Timothy and Nalte, emphasizing the risks that the Irish boy had taken and the selfless motivations that had driven his actions. As the war chief spoke, Timothy could see Iron Wolf's expression changing from suspicion to surprise to something that might have been the beginning of respect. When Stone Eagle had finished his account, Iron Wolf addressed Timothy directly, speaking in English that was more fluent and sophisticated than Timothy had expected from an Apache chief. "Young man," Iron Wolf said formally, "I am told that you found my grandson in the desert and helped him return to his people. This is a great service that you have done for my family and my band. How do you wish to be rewarded for your kindness?" Timothy was surprised by the question, having never considered that he might receive any reward for helping Nalte. His motivations had been purely humanitarian, and the satisfaction of seeing the boy safely reunited with his family was compensation enough for the risks and hardships he had endured. "Chief Iron Wolf," Timothy replied respectfully, "I don't want any reward. I just wanted to make sure Nalte got back to his family. I'm happy that he's safe, and I'm honored that you allowed me to come into your territory to help him." Iron Wolf studied Timothy's face with the same careful attention that Stone Eagle had shown, obviously trying to understand the character and motivations of this unusual white boy. After several moments, the chief nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with what he had observed. "Timothy McKenna," Iron Wolf said, using Timothy's full name with careful pronunciation, "you have shown that it is possible for white people and Apache people to help each other instead of fighting each other. This is a lesson that both our peoples need to learn if we are to survive in the changing world that surrounds us." The chief paused, consulting briefly with several advisors who had gathered around him. then made an announcement that would transform Timothy's simple act of charity into something far more significant than either he or Nalte could have anticipated. "It is the custom of my people to honor those who show great kindness to our children," Iron Wolf continued. "You have risked your life to save my grandson, and you have traveled through dangerous territory to return him safely to his family. Such courage and compassion deserve recognition not just from our family, but from our entire nation." Iron Wolf gestured toward one of his advisors, who produced a beautifully decorated drum and began beating out a rhythm that Timothy recognized as some sort of ceremonial pattern. The sound of the drum carried across the entire encampment, and within minutes, people began gathering around the group, forming a large circle that encompassed Timothy, Nalte, and the tribal leaders. "Tonight," Iron Wolf announced in a voice that carried to every person in the gathering, "we will hold a feast and ceremony to honor Timothy McKenna, the white boy who saved the life of our child. We will adopt him as an honorary member of our band, and we will send messengers to all Apache peoples telling them of his courage and kindness." The announcement created a stir of amazement and approval among the assembled Apache, as people recognized the unprecedented nature of what their chief was proposing. Adopting a white person into the tribe, even in an honorary capacity, was virtually unheard of and represented a dramatic departure from traditional Apache practices. But Iron Wolf was not finished with his announcements. "Furthermore," the chief continued, "we will send representatives to the white settlements throughout this territory, carrying the message that Timothy McKenna and all who serve the cause of peace between our peoples will be under the protection of the Apache nation. Any who harm him will answer to our warriors." The implications of Iron Wolf's declaration were staggering. Timothy, a 12-year-old Irish orphan, had somehow become a symbol of the possibility for peaceful relations between whites and Indians, and his safety was now a matter of concern to one of the most powerful Apache bands in the Southwest. As the day progressed and preparations for the evening ceremony began, Timothy found himself at the center of a level of attention and honor that he had never experienced in his young life. Apache women presented him with traditional clothing appropriate for the adoption ceremony. Elders shared stories about the significance of the rituals he would participate in, and warriors offered him instruction in the customs and protocols that would govern his new relationship with the tribe. But perhaps most meaningful to Timothy was the time he was able to spend with Nalte and his family, finally seeing the complete context of the young Apache's life and understanding the full scope of what his rescue had meant to his people. Nalte's mother, a woman named Morning Star, spoke to Timothy through interpreters to express her gratitude for saving her son's life and her admiration for his courage in bringing the boy home. "She says," the interpreter explained, "that you have given her the most precious gift that anyone can give to a mother, the life of her child. She says that you will always be welcome in her home and that her family will always be grateful for what you have done." Nalte's grandfather, a distinguished elder named Grey Wolf, who was Iron Wolf's older brother, presented Timothy with a carved wooden flute that had been in their family for generations. He says, the interpreter continued, that this flute was made by his own grandfather, and that it has the power to call the spirits of protection for those who play it with pure hearts. He wants you to have it as a reminder that you will always have family among the Apache people. As evening approached and the formal ceremony began, Timothy found himself participating in rituals that few white people had ever witnessed, much less been honored by. He was dressed in traditional Apache clothing. His face was painted with symbols representing courage and compassion, and he was seated in the position of honor beside Chief Iron Wolf and the other tribal leaders. The ceremony itself was a complex blend of religious ritual, social celebration, and political statement that lasted well into the night. Apache dancers performed traditional dances that told stories of heroism and sacrifice. Tribal singers chanted songs that honored the spirits of protection and guidance, and speakers from various clans offered testimonials about the significance of Timothy's actions and their implications for future relations between the races. But the climax of the ceremony came when Chief Iron Wolf formally pronounced Timothy's adoption into the Apache Nation and announced the name by which he would be known among Indian peoples throughout the Southwest. From this day forward, Iron Wolf declared in both Apache and English, so that everyone present could understand the significance of his words, "This white boy shall be known among all Apache as he who saves children. He has shown that the barriers between our peoples can be crossed by those with courage and compassion, and he has proven that kindness is stronger than hatred." The new name and status conferred upon Timothy carried implications that extended far beyond the ceremony itself. Word of his adoption and the protection granted to him by Iron Wolf's band began spreading immediately throughout the network of Apache communities in the region, creating a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. But perhaps even more significantly, Iron Wolf's promise to send representatives to white settlements with news of Timothy's actions and his new status was about to create one of the most extraordinary diplomatic missions in the history of the American Southwest. The next morning, as Timothy prepared to return to Mesquite Flats under Apache escort, Iron Wolf took him aside for a private conversation that would help the young man understand the full implications of what he had accomplished through his simple act of sharing bread with a hungry child. "Timothy," the chief said, speaking in English but using the tone of voice that Apache fathers used when imparting important wisdom to their sons, "what you did for Nalte was a small thing in your eyes, but it has become a large thing in the eyes of both our peoples. You have shown that it is possible for whites and Indians to help each other, and that is a lesson that could change the future of this territory." Iron Wolf paused, looking out over the valley where his people lived and worked, then continued with obvious emotion in his voice. "For too long, our peoples have seen each other only as enemies. White settlers fear Apache raiders, and Apache families fear cavalry soldiers. Children on both sides grow up believing that the other race is evil and must be destroyed. But you have shown that this does not have to be true." The chief turned back to Timothy, his expression both serious and hopeful. "When my representatives visit the white settlements to tell your story, they will carry a message of peace from the Apache Nation. They will say that we are willing to live in friendship with whites who show the same courage and compassion that you have shown. They will offer to negotiate agreements that can end the fighting and allow both our peoples to prosper in this land." Timothy was amazed by the scope of what Iron Wolf was describing, and he began to understand that his simple act of charity had somehow become the catalyst for a major diplomatic initiative that could reshape relations between whites and Indians throughout Arizona territory. "Chief Iron Wolf," Timothy said carefully, "I'm honored that you think my actions are important enough to justify such major changes. But I'm just a kid, and I don't have any authority to speak for white people or make agreements on their behalf." Iron Wolf smiled, and there was both wisdom and affection in his expression. "Timothy, you do not need authority to speak for your people, because your actions have already spoken for you. When Apache representatives tell white settlers about the boy who risked his life to save an Indian child, they will be forced to consider whether the stories they have been told about Apache savagery are entirely true. And when they learn that the Apache Nation is willing to extend protection and friendship to those who show kindness to our people, they will have to decide whether they prefer war or peace." The chief's words proved to be prophetic. Over the following weeks, Apache representatives did indeed visit white settlements throughout southern Arizona, carrying the story of Timothy's actions and Iron Wolf's message of potential cooperation. The response was mixed, with some settlers expressing skepticism about Apache intentions, while others began to consider whether peaceful coexistence might be preferable to the constant threat of warfare. But the most immediate and dramatic response came in Mesquite Flats itself, where Timothy's return, after a week's absence, had caused considerable concern among the residents who knew and cared about him. Father Hernandez had been particularly worried, understanding the dangers that Timothy faced in his mission to help Nalte, and the old priest had organized prayer services asking for the boy's safe return. When Timothy finally appeared on the outskirts of Mesquite Flats, accompanied by 6 Apache warriors who served as his escort and honor guard, the reaction of the settlement's residents was a mixture of relief, amazement, and alarm. Most people had never seen Apache warriors who weren't engaged in raiding or warfare, and the sight of them traveling peacefully with a white child challenged every assumption they held about Indian intentions and capabilities. The Apache escorts, led by Stone Eagle, had been carefully instructed by Chief Iron Wolf about how to conduct themselves during this unprecedented diplomatic mission. They were to demonstrate Apache honor and dignity, while also making it clear that they came in peace and friendship rather than as a prelude to attack. Stone Eagle requested permission to address the assembled residents of Mesquite Flats, and his speech, delivered in formal English before a crowd that included everyone from the settlement, became one of the most remarkable diplomatic presentations in frontier history. "People of Mesquite Flats," Stone Eagle began, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering, "I am Stone Eagle of the Apache Nation, and I come to you with a message from Chief Iron Wolf and all our people. We come not as enemies, but as friends who wish to honor the courage of one of your children." The war chief went on to describe Timothy's actions in detail, emphasizing the risks he had taken and the selfless motivations that had driven his decision to help a lost Apache child. As Stone Eagle spoke, Timothy could see the expressions on the faces of his neighbors changing from suspicion and fear to amazement and pride. "This boy," Stone Eagle continued, gesturing toward Timothy, "has shown that it is possible for white people and Apache people to help each other instead of fighting each other. He has earned the gratitude of our nation and the protection of our warriors. Anyone who harms Timothy McKenna will answer to the Apache people." The declaration of Apache protection for Timothy created a stir of amazement among the residents of Mesquite Flats, as people realized that their young neighbor had somehow achieved a level of status and recognition with the Apache that no white person in the territory had ever attained. But Stone Eagle was not finished with his announcements. "Chief Iron Wolf has instructed me to tell you that the Apache Nation is willing to make peace with all white people who show the same courage and kindness that Timothy has shown. We are tired of war, and we believe that both our peoples can prosper if we learn to live together as neighbors rather than enemies." The peace offer presented by Stone Eagle represented a dramatic departure from the traditional Apache approach to white encroachment, and it created immediate debate among the residents of Mesquite Flats about how to respond to such an unprecedented opportunity. Mayor Henderson, a businessman who had been elected largely because of his reputation for practical problem-solving, stepped forward to respond on behalf of the community. "Stone Eagle, we are honored by your visit and amazed by the story you have told us about young Timothy. We are also interested in your chief's offer of peace, but such agreements require careful consideration and consultation with territorial authorities." Stone Eagle nodded, understanding of the mayor's position. Chief Iron Wolf expected that white leaders would need time to consider his offer. "We do not ask for immediate answers, only that you think about whether war or peace is better for your children's future." The Apache delegation remained in Mesquite Flats for 3 days, during which time they conducted formal negotiations with community leaders about the possibility of establishing peaceful relations between the settlement and Iron Wolf's band. These negotiations, facilitated by Timothy's unique status as an adopted member of the Apache Nation, resulted in preliminary agreements that would serve as models for similar accords throughout the territory. More importantly, the presence of Apache warriors in Mesquite Flats provided an opportunity for ordinary residents to interact with Indians in a non-threatening context for the first time in their lives. Children who had been taught to fear all Indians were able to observe Apache customs and culture without danger, while adults discovered that their supposed enemies possessed intelligence, dignity, and values that were not so different from their own. When the Apache delegation finally departed, they carried with them not just Timothy's gratitude and the formal responses from community leaders, but also personal messages from individual residents who had been touched by their interactions with the visiting warriors. These messages, when delivered to Apache communities throughout the region, helped create a network of personal connections that transcended the official diplomatic agreements. Timothy's story and his adoption by the Apache became a sensation throughout Arizona Territory, with newspapers as far away as San Francisco carrying accounts of the Irish orphan who had bridged the gap between whites and Indians through a simple act of compassion. The publicity generated by these stories attracted the attention of territorial officials, military commanders, and religious leaders who were interested in exploring whether Timothy's experience could be replicated and expanded into broader peace initiatives. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Timothy's actions was the precedent it established for individual acts of kindness and courage, serving as catalysts for major social and political changes. His willingness to help a hungry child, regardless of racial or cultural differences, had demonstrated that ordinary people could influence the course of history through moral choices that transcended the limitations of their circumstances. Father Hernandez, watching Timothy grow and mature in the months following his extraordinary adventure, often reflected on the divine providence that had placed such a compassionate heart in the body of an orphaned child. The old priest understood that Timothy's actions had been motivated by the same Christian principles that had guided his own long life of service to others, and he took pride in knowing that his teachings had borne fruit in such remarkable ways. Timothy himself remained remarkably humble about the attention and honor that his actions had generated, continuing to live simply in the rooms behind the church and to work at odd jobs around the settlement to support himself and help Father Hernandez care for other orphaned children. But he also began to understand that his unique status as an adopted member of the Apache Nation carried responsibilities as well as honors. Over the following years, Timothy served as an unofficial ambassador between the white and Apache communities, helping to negotiate peaceful resolutions to conflicts that might otherwise have escalated into violence. His fluency in Apache languages and customs, combined with his obvious integrity and good faith, made him a valuable mediator in situations where mistrust and cultural misunderstanding threatened to undermine fragile peace agreements. The friendship between Timothy and Nalty continued to flourish, despite the geographical and cultural distances that separated their daily lives. Nalty grew up to become a respected warrior and leader within his own community, but he never forgot the white boy who had saved his life, and he often spoke to his own children about the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their appearance or tribal affiliation. When Timothy reached adulthood, he was offered positions with territorial government agencies and military units that valued his knowledge of Apache culture and his unique ability to communicate across racial boundaries. But he chose instead to remain in Mesquite Flats, continuing his work with Father Hernandez and serving as a living reminder that peace between the races was possible when people chose compassion over fear. The settlement of Mesquite Flats itself was transformed by the events that began with Timothy's simple act of sharing bread with a hungry child. The community became known throughout the Southwest as a place where whites and Indians could interact peacefully, and it attracted settlers who were interested in building a society based on cooperation rather than conflict. Years later, When historians began studying the factors that led to improved relations between whites and Native Americans in Arizona Territory, they consistently identified Timothy McKenna's rescue of Nalte as a pivotal moment that demonstrated the possibility for understanding and cooperation between peoples who had been taught to see each other as irreconcilable enemies. But Timothy himself, when asked about his role in these historical developments, always insisted that he had done nothing more than what any decent person should do when confronted with a child in need. His modesty and genuine humility only enhanced his reputation and made his example more powerful for those who sought to follow in his footsteps. The story of the orphan boy who shared his bread with a native child became a legend throughout the American West, told and retold around campfires and in schoolhouses as an example of how individual acts of kindness could triumph over hatred and prejudice. And in the years that followed, many other young people found the courage to reach across racial and cultural boundaries, inspired by Timothy's example and encouraged by the knowledge that compassion was stronger than fear. This incredible tale reminds us that the most profound changes in human history often begin with the simplest acts of kindness. Timothy McKenna's willingness to share his meager meal with a starving child didn't just save one life. It opened a door to understanding and peace that had seemed permanently closed by generations of conflict and mistrust. When we choose compassion over indifference, love over fear, and understanding over prejudice, we create possibilities that extend far beyond our imagination. If this story of childhood generosity changing the course of history has touched your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of the incredible power that lies within simple acts of human kindness. After all, we never know when our own moment of compassion might change the world.